Reality is tough. It can make you be quite worried about things, and if you feel that some mercenary decision-making is required of the moment, reality is going to give you all the evidence, all the justification that you need to make those mercenary decisions. Yet if you're making a piece of art, making a product for people who really enjoy a series, that can lead to people not being particularly pleased, and that today is what takes me to the story of Creative Assembly. Not only has Hyenas died, but a sea of people have descended upon the Total War Pharaoh Steam page. The latest, of course, in the historical Total War games. Things are not going well for what I at this stage would almost call an embattled studio. If you've not been listening to the news, even on Warhammer, the thing that seems to be their safe cash cow, not all has been good. But what is good, if you want to support the show, is to pick up the art book, The Art and the Making of the Pale Beyond, which is our first video game project. Of course, it's on Steam in the eShop if you've not picked it up already. This is an absolutely gorgeous book, full of art, insight, explanations from the team of how we put the game together. You can check it out on store.bellular.games. They're now in stock for immediate shipping. Let's rock then. The Steam rating is 60%, which, as a general percentage, isn't terrible, but if somebody says to you, oh, that movie's a 60 in Rotten Tomatoes, it's a 6 out of 10, it's 3 out of 5 stars, you're maybe not going to go and pick it up at full price. But it's actually not that number that is especially terrifying to me. It is that fewer than 1,000 people have left reviews. That means that while there is frustration, there is also quite a lot of apathy, and you can see why. This is a game with a smaller scope. It does not have the grand campaign that perhaps spans Europe, Asia, maybe even other sides of the world, like we've seen in games like, say, Rome 2, Medieval, Empire. No, it is not that. Even though this is being billed, both literally and figuratively, as a big, full-sized historical Total War game, rather than one of the smaller Sagas projects, as have existed in the past, with Thrones of Britannia and Troy. Indeed, Troy and this will be actually rather similar. The thing though is, if you actually look at the critical reception here, is all of this the fault of Creative Assembly Sophia? What is actually going on? Because if you are you could almost say a fair weather, a perhaps casual fan of the franchise, and you go here, you'll be like, yep, it's Total War, it's set in this time period, it's executing its things about as expected for a Total War game, with, as Creative Assembly Sophia often do, a bit of a twist on the campaign mode that makes it more interesting. And through that lens, a top critic average of 78 somewhat can be understandable, yet take a look at YouTube and we will see this is just bad, not worth $60, Total War Pharaoh fails in almost every way. The Brutal Truth Total War Pharaoh review. And the reason why these things feel different is some vital community context. There is a general malaise going on with the Total War franchise and Creative Assembly as a whole. Some of this comes from the recent situation with Total War Warhammer 3, a game that on launch was honestly a hot mess with a campaign, with all of its sort of weird battle features and stuff that actually wasn't really good, and with DLC prices that have went up. A community manager explained why all of this is going on because of development costs, that ongoing development has got to be sustainable, but to the community, they didn't really take it that well. You may think this is just some entitled gamers being angry that they're having to pay money for product, but in this case, the price hike really was quite large amidst the more broad context of, Total War being a franchise that is not innovating in its very core. Things like how combat works, how good AI is, things like that. And this actually means that Total War Warhammer 3 is at 61 on Steam. That means that a lot of people are not feeling that great about what's going on. And you can really see why this has happened. So number one, you've got Hyenas, that apparently was like their most expensive game project ever. That has been killed. A lot of people are feeling like this is taking resources away from Total War. Like, why are you doing Hyenas of all things when you could just continue with the franchise that works? And in the back of everyone's heads, they're thinking, come on, where's the next medieval game? That's exactly what we would want. And if you're a historical fan, yes, we did get Total War 3 Kingdoms. However, it still had, I would say, a bunch of issues in, the actual real-time combat that are kind of unresolved in the Total War franchise and have been there for a very long time. But also, you've been drip-fed the Saga games. I mean, Thrones of Britannia is kind of like an expandalone DLC for Attila. It didn't really offer a lot, it had some interesting ideas, but as a full package, it just did not end up working for people. You then, of course, have Troy. Troy is a very strange game. Not a massive number of people played it, even though a lot of people did own it, but that's because it was free. It was free on launch day on the Epic Games Store, and yes, while it did later release on Steam, it really did not set that platform on fire. And that's where we get to Pharaoh. Of course, in terms of time period, Total War Pharaoh and Troy are happening in a fairly similar one, albeit in slightly different geographical regions. Now, Pharaoh is a full-fledged Total War title in terms of its marketing and its cost. And you might think, what do you mean by that? And what I basically mean is Rome 1, full-fledged Total War. Medieval 2, which, was kind of like an advancement of Rome, but people would still count Medieval 2 as that. Rome 2 Total War, that's a full-fledged Total War. Empire, right? Empire, full-fledged historical Total War. Often in this franchise, we've sort of seen a really, really big expansive game and then a more focused game. Empire Total War, Napoleon Total War. That's kind of the way the things had went. And when you look at something like Pharaoh, you basically see an expansion, right? Because in times gone by, this would have been the Kingdoms expansion of Medieval 2, perhaps the Charlemagne expansion of Attila. So essentially a separate, but not necessarily standalone campaign for a core Total War game. Of course, they have had their core team developing the likes of Thrones of Britannia, Creative Assembly, Sophia, and they developed Troy as a Saga game. These are usually slightly cheaper than the regular games. They are standalone titles that shrink down to give you a focused sort of fantasy in a smaller region and a very specific one of history, right? These Saga titles then have got the reputation of not being a true, full Total War title. And that's basically because they tripped out of the gate. The first one launched very messily. It never recovered. It's got 69% out of 10,800 reviews on Steam. It did have some good changes, some interesting ones like what it did with food, but overall it didn't really go tremendously. Then you look at Troy, you see, oh, look at that, it's blue text. It says mostly positive, but the actual difference in review score is only 3. It's coming in at a 72. So it's quite obvious why historical Total War fans don't really feel that they've been given a great deal. Of course, then you look at Total War 3 Kingdoms, which I think went down like pretty well as a game. It doesn't seem to have had as much of an impact in the West. I believe it did do quite well in China, but in terms of DLC support, it doesn't really seem like it's had the best. And this is where things get rather funny. We can look here at the Total War franchise on Steam charts. Of course, usually newer games have loads of concurrence. Older ones don't. Not really so. Number 1, we have Total War Warhammer 3 sitting here at about 14.8k. We then have got Total War Rome 2. Yeah, Rome 2, still there doing the numbers. And then we have Pharaoh. And what was very interesting is the launch peak of Pharaoh was 4,701. And really, I was kind of shocked by this. So here's the actual page for it itself, right? Now, I thought this launched on like a Tuesday or a Wednesday. Maybe the numbers will be bigger by the weekend. Do you see that? No. Look what happens here. As I record this, it is midday on Tuesday. Look at that Sunday to Monday drop. That really is pretty darn large. Of course, Pharaoh, the big brand new game, pretty much at launch was trading blows with Medieval 2, which came out like, 16 years ago, 17 years ago? A long-ass time ago anyway, that's basically my point. It's doing similar to Empire, right? And if we want to think about how well the Saga titles are doing, well, let's go and find Thrones of Britannia. 351. Let's find Troy. Also, at the time of this screenshot, 351, which is a little bit odd. Anyhow, core point is these Saga titles have not had staying power, and I think you can absolutely see why. Look at Rome 2. Rome 2 is like a platform. It covers a big span of history and a shitload of content, loads of different factions, all that stuff. Whereas you look at these, more focused-in titles, they obviously don't have the staying power. They're obviously not providing a sandbox that really has enough for people to last. I mean, the idea that people are still playing Rome 1, Medieval 2, Empire, and the newer games are almost floundering It's quite crazy. I mean, you look at these numbers and you think, why the hell are you not making Medieval 3? Because Medieval 2 came out in 2006, and it's the 4th highest game in terms of concurrent players. This obviously is information that Creative Assembly knows. They don't need us to point that out to them. They already know that. So the question is, why haven't they done that sort of thing? And the answer is, they still know they can do things to help the long tail of these games. Rome 2, late in life, had a little bit of a turnaround. I was there for the launch. The launch was absolutely disastrous. And they actually had, along with Emperor Edition, some new DLCs. DLCs that were created by Creative Assembly Sophia, who would later on go and do Troy and, of course, now do Pharaoh. There is another side of this as well. Whenever you look at some of those larger, full-size historical games, you can't not talk about mods. If you were to look at, say, like Nexus mods here, you see, thousands and thousands of downloads for the various different games. If you look at Steam Workshop, though, well, you see 7,000 mods for Total War Realm 2 alone. Unfortunately, we can't see download numbers exactly, but Divide et Impera, that is, 10 out of 10. It is amazing. It's what I've most recently played Rome 2 on. And certainly if you're somebody who doesn't like the sort of faster balancing of Rome 2, how some of that combat changed, yeah, that is absolutely the mod pack to get. What this does, though, is it greatly extends the life of that game. Some would say that it's Creative Assembly letting modders finish the game, because Rome 2 was quite the disaster. But it also is modders making a different permutation of the game that maybe more hardcore historical fans would like, because looking at a lot of these mods, what they are focused on is changing the combat model, making things more historically accurate, and also just, well, giving things a lot more depth. And so we're left in a strange situation. There's a lot of games that are not really meeting people's expectations at launch. I mean, Creative Assembly is kind of renowned for being a don't purchase their game on day one studio. We have modders coming in, doing quite a lot of work, a lot of DLC for some of their titles, but some of the Warhammer people not feeling great about how they're being supported. Meanwhile, the historical fans are probably feeling especially bad about how they have been supported. You've got a feeling of a lack of support on individual games, that they're kind of moving on to the next thing. So you see the likes of the Sagas, the Saga games just sitting there at the very bottom of the pile, and really not the best value proposition, especially as Total War Warhammer 3 has so many problems. And then, of course, it's got its overall cost, because considering how all of those games sort of combine and really just have been kind of one broad Total War Warhammer experience over the years, you are, looking at nearly £300. But at the same time, people obviously understand they want to keep on having things that they feel are a good value proposition so that they can keep buying it, so Creative Assembly can keep making it. As Legend of Total War said in his recent video, nobody has won here. Like, their games are not doing as well. They are, some people are boycotting them, yes. There at the very least is a lot of anger. You look at like that new DLC, it's kind of review bombed, doesn't seem to have produced great numbers. You look at, say, the Steam DB player number data, and it doesn't seem that that DLC actually really led to as much of a spike of players. And you may say, well, it's more expensive, they can afford to get by with fewer people buying it, less of a player spike. To which I then say, Warhammer 3, Warhammer, it is a platform, and if you attrit players over time, you are eroding your core audience base. And all of this basically means that nobody's winning out of this situation. Creative Assembly clearly are not able to do their best, and for players aren't exactly getting what they want. Absolutely everybody here loses. And some, of course, may look at the other big European publisher that does a whole bunch of strategy games, of course, in Paradox. Paradox also do a lot of DLC. I mean, take a look at Stellaris, came out in 2016. We have all of these. Hearts of Iron 4, also 2016, massive amount of DLC. Imperator Rome, yep, that one kind of fell over. Let's not talk about that. Crusader Kings 3, of course, it's been getting a whole bunch of support. Crusader Kings 2 had a staggering amount of DLC, and Victoria 3, of course, also getting plenty of support, with Sphere of Influence coming out in 2024. And certainly, if you look at version 1 of the game, I mean, almost every version of Stellaris has been reviewed and replaced in line with, feedback and testing, almost to the point where one of the issues Stellaris has is different people enjoyed the game sort of to different degrees at various different points in its development history, because it has actually grown and changed so much through its life. So you see this perception of, yep, we have to pay for a lot of DLC, but also this is quite a lot of support. Let's look at Creative Assembly's titles then. And that's where it gets kind of interesting. There's a lot of DLC, and it really would be a lot for me to just list all of this out here. And you could say, though, that this is just kind of no rhyme or reason. Like Shogun 2, it gets 1 year of content support. You know, there's 5 faction packs, and of course, Fall of the Samurai, I think, is one of the greatest DLCs that's really ever happened. Of course, you've got 6 campaign packs for Rome 2, one of them being free, so that's technically 5 years of content support. Total War Attila, that's no more support after a year. Total War Warhammer, that kind of stops after a year because, of course, we get into Warhammer 2, which has 3.5 years of content support with a lot of stuff. You have Thrones of Britannia, no DLC. Three Kingdoms, which had 2 years of support. Troy, which actually had 3 campaign packs and then a sort of campaign mode pack, so technically 1.5 years of support, and then Total War Warhammer 3. And what all of this kind of shows to us is a little bit of a lack of rhyme or reason. They're just, you know, sometimes there's free support, sometimes they're not. And basically a trend line that is very much propped up by the Warhammer games, especially Warhammer 2 and Rome 2. But think about this more broadly and count expansion packs, and look at what we actually have from Creative Assembly, the studio. We've got Rome Total War, which then has Barbarian Tribes, was it? Whatever it was called, Barbarian Kingdom maybe, Alexander, Medieval 2, Total War Kingdoms, Viking, Battle for Asgard, Empire Total War, Stormrise. Who the hell knows about Stormrise? So many games. I mean, pretty much yearly they have been releasing stuff. Most years have had a Total War game. Of course, the thing that's interesting then with Hyenas is not made by the Total War people. Actually, Creative Assembly have been doing other things. They kind of always have if you look through their company history. So you've got that team that did, I believe, the likes of Viking, Stormrise, London 2012 Olympic Games, Alien Isolation, a stunningly good game, and then obviously the development hell of Hyenas. So they absolutely have been pumping out a hell of a lot of content. And what are the times when Total War hasn't been yearly? Well, there's 2008 when they were working on Empire, which was the first game in the Warscape 32 engine, and then 2021 when they were working on Warhammer 3, which is the first core Creative Assembly game in the Warscape 3264 engine. But basically, there's always a new product, be it expansion, new game launch, or DLC. And what that essentially means is a brutal launch cadence. Absolutely brutal. Now, you go into the development rumors and stuff that have surrounded Hyenas, of that being a long shit show, even Alien Isolation being a bit of a shit show in development as well. You then take a look at what core Creative Assembly have had to do with the Total War franchise, and is there any wonder that they haven't been able to take a long time, maybe take a year or two off those core releases so that they can actually have, say, AI be better, or work in the fundamentals of melee combat, which, let's be real, as we moved from Medieval 2 into Empire, melee combat kind of never felt the same, right? And look, I'm not going to pull you into the very extended discussion the Total War community has been having about things like, say, unit cohesion and melee combat, but they certainly have had interesting impacts on gameplay as we went through time. But my core point here is it's been pretty rough. And if we're to assume that the sort of main, you know, big, like Creative Assembly core team, the old team working in Total War, the idea that they have mostly been working on Warhammer, and then Sophia have been basically tasked with keeping historical alive with bare minimum effort. I mean, we actually looked through these, right? So, at roughly the same time, you've been having the Warhammer games be made, and also Three Kingdoms. Three Kingdoms being a pretty big scale historical Total War game. That being said, Three Kingdoms, you know, it is mostly set in basically in China, in terms of, you know, big unit variety and stuff like that. It's probably not the largest that there ever was. I mean, certainly if you said to me, hey, you've got 2 years, you can either make Medieval 2 or, you know, Medieval 2, like with anything near the scope of the original, or you could make Three Kingdoms. I mean, you probably would end up choosing Three Kingdoms. It's all sort of different cultures within a very broader, big culture. I mean, I know that that's grossly not going into detail about the many historical differences and history in that region, but I think you get my drift, right? Versus, you got to do a whole bunch of Europe, a whole bunch of Africa, and a bit of Asia too, if it's medieval. And I mean, hey, medieval even took us to Latin America, which was quite something, or perhaps even empire, as we went between, we went between India, Europe, and the Americas. Like, those are damn big games. And that makes me think then, what comes next after Warhammer 3? And that is where my personal hopium, if I was to take a big long rip of that hopium, I would kind of be thinking, right, the people who did Three Kingdoms are probably working on Medieval 3. If you look at the numbers, put on your business hat and your business suit, get yourself in the, look at a picture of Bobby Kotick, then look back to the, to me and think about business. Now, look at this chart. Rome 2, kind of existing there. Look, Medieval 2 Definitive Edition, a game from 2006, is pretty much trading blows with these very new things. Obviously, Medieval 3, if you were to do a 4 or 5 year development project, true biggest scale of a actual AAA dev cycle, would you put it into anything other than a new Medieval? I think the answer is absolutely not. So, I think Creative Assembly's next big historical Total War project will be Medieval 3. I think that Medieval 3 DLC support will likely be done by Creative Assembly Sophia, because what's very obviously happened in my mind is, they did Three Kingdoms, they did Thrones of Britannia, then Sophia did Troy, Sophia did Pharaoh. Of course, Sophia did DLC support for Rome 2, along with Emperor Edition. I think that's where Sophia kind of cut their teeth. Basically, they were another studio who were working on that DLC. Then they were acquired by Creative Assembly. That's why they're called Creative Assembly Sophia. Right, so the Sophia team clearly are doing the best that they can with what they've been given. And when you actually look at the reviews of Pharaoh, people are not talking about, oh, damn, Creative Assembly Sophia have bent us over and ruined us again. Terrible. Look how greedy Sophia are. Nobody is saying that. I mean, some people are, I'm sure, but basically no. What people are saying is Sophia are doing their best within the size of their team, the timelines they're given, the resources that they're given. Because evidently Troy came out in 2020, now in 2023, Pharaoh has came out, and people are kind of thinking like, why does Pharaoh feel like a mostly reskin of Troy? Well, the answer is fairly obvious. Now, this is where I would point out that Medieval 2 is a reskin of Rome Total War. I mean, you look at Rome Total War, you look at Medieval 2, you look at how crazy fast those development cycles are, and yeah, they're two highly similar games, but I think the point there is they were both big in scope and sort of targeted different, like historical fantasies that were broad, very broad appeal. I think that's why they happen to do so well. And of course, they were able to harbor quite a lot in their, in their combat experience, whereas in Pharaoh, they don't have that unit diversity because we really are going quite a bit back in the past. Now, they do have issues like the Warscape engine and Chariots do not always happen to mix together that well, and you can have issues that impact your combat experience, but my God, have Sophia done everything they can within that, with, the weather system impacting the battlefield with, mud and all the things of the different troops. They have tried so hard to get combat variety in what is otherwise a more limited in diversity setting. So I think people don't blame Sophia. It's just since 3K and 3K's pretty limited content support, if there is a team that is separate to Warhammer 3 at core Creative Assembly, I think they've been working on the next big thing, and I think Sophia have been tasked with just keeping the thing alive. And then as we look at Pharaoh, we then think, why was Pharaoh billed as a full historical Total War title? I mean, you can say to people who like history, people like me, it's the Sea Peoples will come, and you'll be playing the game when the Sea Peoples come. You get to play the Bronze Age collapse. To someone like me, that's like music to my ears, right? But this is still a Troy-sized game. They have increased the price. It does not feel as good of a deal. And here's where we see the historical Total War fans being asked to pay more for less. In the same way that the Warhammer Creative Assembly game fans have also been recently asked to pay more for less. And ultimately, that is their problem. All while we find out that Hyenas was allegedly Sega's biggest budget game ever. Quote, total lack of direction. No wonder it feels bad. And this, I think, is where we look to take a shot whenever somebody talking about games on YouTube mentions Larian. And I don't say that to be like, be perfect. Absolutely, no, I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is Larian found their thing, got really good at it, and at one point they took a really big bet to, after Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2, go real big on the most ambitious thing that they'd done. That was only done off a rock solid amount of just competence and experience. You look here, yeah, I know that you guys have been having other things in your company. People who maybe don't know this, Creative Assembly had a bunch of like sports titles, I believe, and other things before like Medieval 1 came out, and then of course Shogun, and that's what just made everyone's minds explode back in the day. Like I remember playing Rome and then playing Shogun after, and that was just a crazy experience. I mean, you even had Rome Total War being it was a British television show where contestants would basically like reenact military strategy from like ancient famous battles, and they used Rome Total War as the visualization, which was quite funny. But anyway, they've always had like this other thing that they've done. But in a world where Alien Isolation is not the sort of thing they're going to make a lot of, where you then go from 2014 to Hyenas now, losing that much money, you just think, what if that Hyenas money was going, and I'm not just saying spend $70 million on Medieval 2 or Medieval 3, but what if a portion of that like went in that direction? What if they said, you know what? These non-core Creative Assembly games that we keep on making, are core for what we're known for in the market, they are just not as safe, but they don't make sense. How about we completely double down on doing the best we can possibly do in the thing that we're good at? And I think that ultimately is the problem. If you are trying to just keep something alive on life support via these Sagas titles, I think they're kind of missing the point. Warhammer is a sandbox. You wouldn't want to make a Warhammer Total War 4 that is maybe a smaller part of Warhammer lore somewhere else. If you're going to do another Total War Warhammer game, you either make it 40k, which probably wouldn't work, or you make it something like Age of Sigmar, which, in fairness, I don't think people would be that interested in. It's like if you're doing a Total War game, you probably want to go bigger. I mean, yes, Pharaoh is very focused on this one campaign, but it's not like that region of the world was the only place that had history and shit going on at that period of time. Could they have made a far larger game? So the overall lesson here is that they are in the business of creating historical war platforms. And I know platforms can be a dirty word, right? A little Zuck appears in your vision and floats around the place giggling as he wants some metaverse money. Well, that's not what I mean. Point, though, is they're in the platform business. Look at Rome 2. Look how many players it has. That's a goddamn platform. Look at Warhammer 3, Warhammer 2. They've clearly learned, hang on a second, we can just keep making DLC for this bad boy. And even 2 years after launch, look how many people are playing the game. You could do that for Rome. You could do that for Medieval. You could do that for Warhammer. And I have to wonder if that perhaps is the future of their business. If, when they do Medieval 3, will they in fact treat it like how they have treated Warhammer? And I know that Warhammer's in a rough state now, but I've got to say, when Warhammer 2 was at its peak, everyone was having a blast in Mortal Empires. Could you imagine that it's Medieval 3 and that you are eating that good? That is the promise of Creative Assembly, and I hope that they get out of this rough period and are actually able to deliver on that product. Because as Legend of Total War was pointing out in his video, right now, no one's winning, everyone's losing, and like it or not, Creative Assembly make Total War games. No one else really does it like that. So unless some new competitor enters the market and blows us away, we're kind of stuck with Creative Assembly, and that means we have to have a good, sustainable future. That doesn't feel like what we've got right now. Okay, that's it for today's video. Let me know what you think, especially like if you're a longtime Total War fan, what do you think? And if you've just been interested in the franchise, how does all this make you feel? Like, would you jump into a Troy or a Pharaoh, or for you, would you just need to see like, oh wow, Medieval 3, look how big that is, I must play it? Let me know. See you next time.